welcome and briefly introduce our guest speaker today and thank him for joining us today. Dr. J. Leavitt Pearl was trained in ethics, philosophy, and theology at Boston University and Duquesne University. Justin's research covers a wide range of topics, and he's taught hundreds of students in the Pittsburgh region, being a faculty member at Duquesne, St. Vincent, Seton Hill, and Carlow. Today, he'll be focusing on how time impacts the decisions we make each day as part of our personal and professional lives. This focus on raising awareness about the importance of incorporating ethics into all that we do in our lives and careers is one of the primary objectives of the Atkins Center for Ethics at Carlow University, where Justin currently serves as the director. Additionally, the center is committed to bringing ethical reflection to bear on important social issues by providing educational programming to the campus community and the public, providing tools for students to develop into ethical leaders, offering resources for educators and researchers, and providing ethical consultations for businesses and nonprofits. There are more details about the center available in the related content button, which is the gray button at the bottom of the page. You can also find Justin's contact information in that section, as well as on the orange button with the presenter bios. His email is there, as well as on this initial slide, if you want to learn more about what he does at the Atkins Center for Ethics. And without further ado, I'm going to turn off my microphone and pass it over to Justin and begin this presentation.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful and generous introduction. I know everyone here, I'm sure, is quite busy, so I'm going to just move straight into this presentation, which I've entitled Taking Your Time from the Split-Second Decision to Work-Life Balance. So in their 1980 magnum opus, The Metaphors We Live By, the celebrated linguists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson unpack the ways that certain metaphors not only orient our language, but our way of life. There we go. We've all heard the cliche, time is money. But this isn't just a cliche, Lakoff and Johnson argue, but one of these orienting metaphors in our culture. So consider this string of metaphors that the two of them collected. You're wasting my time. This gadget will save you hours. I don't have the time to give you. How do you spend your time these days? That flat tire cost me an hour. I've invested a lot of time in her. I don't have enough time to spare for that. You're running out of time. You need to budget your time. Is it worth your while? Do you have much time left? He's living on borrowed time. You don't use your time profitably. I lost a lot of time when I got sick. Thank you for your time. Time, it seems, is something like a commodity, and a finite commodity at that. It is a truism that we don't have enough time to accomplish all that we need to do. We could all use a 30-hour day. But with every heartbeat, the clock continues to march forward. It's with no small insight, then, that Shakespeare names this forward march devouring time. Undoubtedly, the way we spend our money is an ethical choice. Are my investments harmful or uplifting? Should I give to a charity? What are the environmental costs of this product versus that one? Should I give $1 to my unhoused neighbor I encounter on the street? But following the metaphor, time is money, we can suggest that how we spend our time is an equally significant ethical choice. Indeed, if our time is finite, if its forward march constrains what we do, then the decisions about how we spend our time are ethical decisions. For what else is ethics than determining the best way to do? And these choices can have really deep repercussions. Is delaying this project a prudent move, allowing me to work with deliberate care? Or is it merely procrastination? Should I spend this weekend with my family or finish a time-sensitive project? These are genuine ethical dilemmas. Here our values, prudence, speed, family, responsibility, come crashing together due precisely to the limits on our finite time. It matters how we take our time. Conversely, the way that we use our time also affects our capacity to be ethical. As the business ethicist and former vice president of Alcoa, Bill O'Rourke, emphasizes, our ethical decision-making can be hampered by our real, or more often merely felt, sense that we must make a decision now. As he writes, quote, I saw capable people felled by ethical missteps, often split-second decisions that ruined their reputations and damaged our company's brand. making good, ethical choices often requires us to pause, reflect, to consider many sides, in short, to take our time. And so this afternoon, I'd like to take a bit of your time in order to investigate precisely these tensions. Specifically, I have two goals for this afternoon. First, I'd like to examine the ethics of how we use our time. Second, I would like to consider the way that our ability to be ethical is affected by the way that we use our time. The results of this discussion will not be an easy cliche that we should live in the moment or prepare for the future, because these cliches hide the genuine dilemmas here. We are people with finite time and conflicting responsibilities. Rather, the goal of this presentation is first to provoke you to reflect on the way that you use your time and how this use expresses your values. And second, to provide you with tools to understand how your time management affects your ethical decision making. All right, part one, how do you spend your time? So before I continue, I'd like to undertake a small task, and I'd like to get you involved. I'm already talking too much. So on a piece of paper or a Word document, if you want to open something up, I would like you to take a moment and write down examples of people or things that you feel a sense of responsibility or obligation towards. These could be major responsibilities like a child or a parent that you're caring for. These could be small responsibilities, a bowling club that you go to once a month. They might be intimate, like a romantic partner, or abstract, like a political affiliation. Don't stress about trying to be comprehensive. That would take more time to write down than our whole afternoon together here. But see if you can get 10 or maybe a dozen things that you feel that you have responsibilities towards. And so I'm going to give you just a minute to write those down. So as you're writing, what I would like to do is look at some of the groups or people that you feel responsible for. So I'm going to open up a poll, and I'm going to ask you to just post one example from your list. And you might, and when you do that, I can't actually see what your poll answers are. So I'm going to ask for a little help. If you could also copy and paste your answer into the Q&A chat as well as posting it in the poll, that would be really helpful. So I will open that up for you now. All right, we have children, a huge responsibility. Clients, a really important responsibility. Absolutely. Family, children, lots of family, dogs, pets. My dog is under my desk right now. Clients, boss, parents, employees, spouse. Yeah, absolutely. People that you are managing over, aging parents, aunts, uncles, employers, church groups, a faith community, absolutely. All right. These are all wonderful examples. I came up with, my parents, my brother, my sister-in-law, nieces, nephew, grandparents, my dog, my job, and the various responsibilities that go with that, my church, political organizations that I work with, clubs that I'm part of, friends, family. We all have a lot. So I'm hoping that you're getting a sense. I'm going to click to the next one here. There we go. I hope that you're getting a sense that we are bound by obligations to countless individuals and groups that we feel responsible towards. And the list that we've generated here today are only the tip of the iceberg. We could continue adding responsibilities infinitely. And there precisely lies our problem, right? Our responsibility is infinite, but our time is finite. One of my responsibilities is, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is my dog who's sitting under my desk. His name is Loki. He's a little monster, and I mostly love him anyways. Every morning as I stand in the kitchen making breakfast, he sits on the kitchen floor staring at me with his big Oliver Twist eyes saying, "Please, sir, I want some more." And so I pause making my own breakfast and I pour him his. So one of the most insightful philosophers on the paradox of responsibility was an Algerian philosopher named Jacques Derrida. He too understood the paradoxes of obligation, and like me every morning, he was a pet lover. In 1992, he wrote a text in which he describes feeding his own cat in the morning, much like I do my dog each morning. But staring out of his kitchen window, Derrida could see an alleyway. And in the alleyway, as in many Parisian alleyways, were stray cats. And so Derrida is faced with a stark realization. Each morning he feeds his cat, in full knowledge that he's choosing not to feed the cats in the alleyway, all equally deserving of love and care. Or as he puts it in much starker language, how would you ever justify the fact that you sacrifice all the cats in the world to the cat that you feed at home every day for years, whereas other cats die of hunger in every instant? Of course, Derrida's aim here is not to cast aspersion on pet owners or shame us for not feeding the neighborhood stray. Rather, he sees this sad truth as a model or metaphor of responsibility more broadly. Every decision we make, including and particularly decisions about how we spend our time, is a choice that we are making for something and against countless other things. As he writes, as soon as I enter into a relation with the other, with the gaze, look, request, love, command, or call of the other, I know that I can respond only by sacrificing ethics. That is, by sacrificing whatever obliges me to also respond in the same way, in the same instant, to all others. Derrida realizes that we can't respond to everyone and everything in this instant or in any instant, because our time is finite and our responsibilities are infinite. There are always more cats to feed. So some philosophers have heroically attempted to quantify this responsibility, to organize ethics into a formula whereby we can establish what is truly necessary to do and what is not. They understandably want to tell us when we have, rationally speaking, done enough. The Australian ethicist Peter Singer and the British ethicist Tony Ord, for example, have calculated that it's possible to live a reasonably healthy life at approximately 20,000 pounds or a little under $30,000 a year. And so while they run organizations that encourage people to pledge to donate 1% and 10% respectively of their income to global causes like poverty, malaria, and the like, they have also pushed people to commit to what they call the Further Pledge, a commitment to donate everything earned above that $30,000 line. There is, I think, something beautifully optimistic, if admittedly beautifully naive, about this project. But of course, if its aim is to disentangle the knotted questions of responsibility, I think it's actually ultimately futile. We could give away 100% of our income, and we would still have to decide where to give it to. Indeed, this is precisely the case with our time, because despite our guiding metaphor that time is money, time, unlike money, can't be banked. It can't be saved. We must always give 100% of our time to something. The only question is, how will we spend that time? Thus, contrary to these optimistic ethicists, we must admit that there is no formula that can make infinite obligations fit into finite time. There are always more cats to feed. And so let's get practical about this, because I don't think you came to this meeting for some slightly depressing existentialist philosophy. When we talk about ethics of how we spend our time, we can really move practically in a few different directions. But for today, I want to focus on what is often referred to as work-life balance. So I want to try to make this a little bit more practical. If you were to get to know me, you would probably quickly realize that there is something deeply ironic about me speaking about work-life balance. I am, as I suspect many of you feel, demonstrably terrible at maintaining healthy boundaries between my work life and my life. But I think my natural ineptitude at creating healthy work-life boundaries is, in this instance, counterintuitively, actually something like an asset here. It means that those boundaries that I have been able to construct have, of necessity, been deliberately and intentionally constructed. Now, the United States is a chronically overworked nation. Legislatively, we are among the only OECD nations to lack guaranteed paid vacation, parental leave, as well as a cap on labor hours, for example. The result is that, according to the International Labor Organization, Americans work 137 more hours per year than Japanese workers, 260 more hours per year than British workers, 499 more hours per year than French workers. That's a lot. I also realized I made this graphic myself. I switched Japan and United Kingdom. You should switch those in your head. I apologize. That's my fault. And despite a small drop in productivity during the recent pandemic, this trend appears to be steadily increasing. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, U.S. worker productivity has risen by over 400% since 1950. American work-life balance is precarious in part because we work a lot. Over the last year, this has become even more complicated as the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed a large number of workers, particularly white-collar workers, out of the office and into remote work. No longer buffered by a 30-minute commute, many of us found ourselves unexpectedly working out of our bedrooms and kitchens. I am making this very presentation, as you can probably tell from the background, out of my living room. The boundaries between work life and life have become even more porous than they already were. And there are good reasons to think that this is, for many of us, not a temporary reality. Following successful shifts to remote work, many companies are seeking to permanently relocate considerable portions of their workforce. A survey of 278 executives by McKinsey in August 2020 found that on average, they plan to reduce office space by 30%. I point this out because I think this question of work-life balance is only going to be increasing over the coming decades. Nevertheless, at least for me, this has been a time of work-life reckoning. I entered this pandemic having consistently worked 6 to 7 days a week for about a decade. This was not sustainable. This decade of out-of-balance work affected my relationships, my physical health, and my mental health. When the pandemic hit in early 2020 and my work was shifted to remote, any remainder of a wall between my work and my life seemed to fully dissolve. It suddenly seemed, as I'm sure it seemed to many other people, that I was somehow both always working and never working. There was no work-life balance, but rather a single sort of amorphous melange of both. And the result was a degradation on both fronts. I felt that I had little time for social life, and yet at the same time, my productivity felt like it was crashing. So this should not be too surprising. Humans are, despite our contestations to the contrary, remarkably bad at multitasking. If I could see all your videos, I might say show of hands, who is also responding to emails during this presentation? And of course, no shame there. If I was on your end, I would also be responding to emails during this presentation, I imagine. But numerous psychological studies have consistently shown that humans at a basic level can't multitask. A 2019 study in Cerebrum, for example, remarks simply that, quote, the human mind and brain lack the architecture to perform 2 or more tasks simultaneously. Full stop. And while this is undoubtedly true at a micro level, when we attempt, for example, to text and drive, we do both of them very badly. I think it's equally true at a macro level. When we attempt to work and rest simultaneously, we do both badly. So what I'd like to suggest then is that the creation of a healthy boundary between work and non-work can serve not only to relieve chronic overwork, but it likewise makes periods of dedicated work more efficient. When we create space to be our full self, we are healthier, but we are also more productive. So in my case, the solution came down to a few simple practices that I would like to suggest. And what I want to say is these are going to seem really, really obvious, and I think they are obvious, and yet despite the obviousness of them, I think they are very easy to break the habit of. I want to talk a lot about habit formation. So let me open up that. All right. So number one, you must clock out. That is to say, you must determine when you are done working for the day, and you must protect that time. For me, that time is 5 p.m. For you, it might be 7, it might be 3:30. The specific time is totally irrelevant and will largely depend on a schedule that's specific to your life. You know, whether you have specific hours that your job requires you to work or something along those lines. What does matter is defending that clock out. When the clock hits, we need to stop working, save the half-finished document, save the draft email, and shut the laptop off. Of course, there's always going to be necessary flexibility, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be flexible. An evening meeting, an emergency phone call, etc. And the point here is also not to create guilt, to beat yourself up about failures to protect this time. Rather, the aim is to build the habit. This is the word I want to emphasize, to build the habit of creating healthy boundaries by intentionally practicing these boundaries daily. In fact, as I was working on this presentation on the first draft, at the time I was writing this sentence, the clock hit 5:01. And despite the fact that I was in the middle of a section, I saved the document, I closed down the computer, and I returned to finish it on Monday morning. So that's number one, clock out. Second, the human body needs time to recover from exertion and stress. Create a real weekend. If it's necessary to create boundaries within the day, it is equally important to create boundaries within the week. This doesn't mean that the traditional Saturday, Sunday will work for you or your schedule. My schedule, for example, is a bit strange. I work every Sunday, and so I decided that my weekend would be Friday and Saturday. And this initially required me to rearrange my schedule a lot. And importantly, it required me to rearrange my expectations a lot. But at least for me, the results were transformative. I found that I was taking up new hobbies, hiking and tennis in my case, and as my physical and mental health improved, so did my productivity during my hours when I was actually supposed to be working. Number three, protect your time. In order for these first two practices to be effective, a third is required. It is necessary to protect these times. I mentioned this above, but allow me to clarify what I mean by this idea. In some instances, protecting time is fairly simple. So, for example, as far as it can be avoided, try not to schedule meetings for those times. To be extremely practical, if your office uses a shared calendar system like Microsoft Teams or something similar, perhaps block out those times and mark them as busy on that shared calendar. Not only will this discourage your coworkers from infringing on those times, it will also serve as an important reminder to yourself about your commitment to form healthy habits of boundary making. But much more challenging is avoiding the small ways that work sneaks back into other times. Do you find yourselves checking emails at 10 p.m.? Are you making quick work calls on Saturday? These might appear to be small tasks. In fact, they might even appear to be generous tasks, insofar as they might solve a coworker's problem. But if they're repeated often, they create unhealthy habits. And we'll talk a bit more about habit formation below. And fourth, and finally, the fourth and final practical suggestion is to schedule ahead. In her course on ethical time management, the lawyer Laura Kelly emphasizes the importance of planning one's time in advance as a necessary step to avoiding burnout in an unbalanced work-life relationship. By generating a schedule in advance, perhaps on the first day of the week or each evening, we allow ourselves to see, often quite vividly, where and how we are spending our time, where we are spending the finite time that we have, where we are committing our values. So I'd like to pause here and encourage you to open up your own calendar, turning to your previous week. So if you want to pull out a phone and open up your calendar, I just saw a question. We are about to actually have our second poll question in just a moment. If you want to open up your phone or open up your Google Calendar or whatever you use, I want you to examine your calendar for which values and responsibilities are scheduled there and which ones are not scheduled there. So which values are scheduled there and which ones are not? Because I think this is really important. Often there are things in our life that we deeply and importantly value, but they often don't make it into our calendar. So I'm about to open up a poll, and what I'm going to ask you in this poll is that I would like you to post an estimate of what percentage of your calendar is devoted to non-work values. And I use that word intentionally, right? You know, so we talked about family, we talked about pets, we talked about church, we talked about, you know, hobbies and all of these different things. What percentage of your calendar includes things that aren't related to your work? So I'll open that poll now. Somebody posted in the chat, probably 2%, right? Yeah, absolutely. Less than 10, I'm seeing in the chat. Thank you for also putting in the chat. I really appreciate that. Yeah, right. It's easy for these things to get lost. So I'm going to keep moving forward. So feel free to finish filling out that poll. When stress hits, and it invariably will, whatever is not scheduled will be the first thing that we cut. So have you blocked out time for personal projects, for rest, for family, for hobbies, for exercise, for self-care? Does date night matter? If so, is it in your calendar? Does attending a child's soccer game matter? If so, how come it's not in the calendar? So as the ethicist Michael W. Austin notes, deep relationships are vital for human flourishing, and such depth happens as we invest time and effort into them. These relationships bring obligations, and it's up to us to devote the necessary time to them. This may require some hard choices, but making them will be worth it. All right. I'm going to shift. There's a great comment. He said, very little, and when I do, I feel guilty, right? That is, I think, an absolutely wonderful comment to bring into this group. Yes, when we often feel guilty if we schedule time for ourselves, if we schedule personal time, if we schedule rest time, it is great. And I think it's important to, you know, this is why I want to emphasize themes like productivity, right? That part of what I want to suggest is that creating these boundaries will actually make you better at the work that you feel like you're skipping. All right. So part 2, I'm going to go to the second half here. Why should you take your time? So up to this point, I've primarily focused on the ethical challenges regarding how we spend our time. What I'd like to do now is to shift and think about how the way in which we spend our time affects our capacity to be ethical. So this might sound somewhat counterintuitive. Surely our morality runs deeper than that. Truly ethical decisions are baked into who we are deep down in our souls, right? And I'm not sure. So what we're going to do is I know we just did one, but we're going to do our third poll. We're going to rapid fire. We're going to go into it. And in this poll, this will be another open-ended one. So your question here is going to be, what factors affect our capacity to act ethically? What factors affect our capacity to act ethically? And I tried to leave that somewhat ambiguous on purpose so we can get a variety of types of answers here. And the hour is intentional. These might be things for you or just things that you've noticed in culture more broadly. Since this is an open-ended one, I can't see your responses. So if possible, if you could copy and paste into the Q&A like we did with the first one, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, so I will open that poll. What factors affect our capacity to be ethical? And feel free to just put one thing. Time crunch affects our capacity to be ethical, I see in the chat. Peer pressure, time pressure. Motivation, stress. More stress. Fear. Ooh, parental indoctrination. Yeah, great. We learn values, culture, personal belief, rationalization, deadlines, pressures, incentives, how tired we are. Oh, that's a great one. Morals and values, success, expectations, finances, rushed thinking, compensation structures, environment, conflicts. We could keep going. These are all wonderful. These are great examples that you've pulled out for us. All right. Oops. All right. So experimental research suggests that things are not so simple when it comes to ethical behavior. Much like your wonderful responses in the Q&A, our actions are influenced by much more than our deepest values. In 1997, the psychologist Robert Barron undertook a study of ethical behavior in which subjects were stopped in public and asked for assistance making change for $1. While the control group was stopped in what I'll call a scent neutral part of the mall, other subjects were stopped in close proximity to a Cinnabon or a Mrs. Fields cookie shop. The results are what I would like to describe as unnervingly significant here, with the help from males increasing from 22% to 45%, and from females from 17% to 61%. Good smells, it seems, make us more ethical. A similar 2019 study by Katie Liljenquist, assistant professor of organizational leadership at BYU's Marriott School of Management, found that 22% of participants in a freshly Windexed room indicated a desire to donate to Habitat for Humanity. 22%. Compared to only 6% given exactly the same offer in a neutrally scented room. Other studies have likewise found that we are more likely to be ethical when we have just left the bathroom as to when we are walking towards one. It's apparently quite hard to be ethical when you really have to go. And so on and so forth. We could keep adding more examples here. What we can see is even small things, even unconscious things, affect our capacity to act ethically. Given these studies, it should come as little surprise that we are similarly less likely to perform ethically when, as many of you put in the chat, when we feel stressed, rushed, or pressed for time. The most ethically dangerous decision, temporally speaking, is the split-second decision. To repeat the words of the business ethicist Bill O'Rourke quoted above, I saw capable people felled by ethical missteps, often split-second decisions that ruined their reputation and damaged our company's brand. Humans, simply put, are not very good at thinking quickly. So I guess I'm realizing at this point the theme of this is all the things humans are bad at. We're bad at multitasking and thinking quickly. All right. What I want to do now is I'm going to open up a video that I think really well exemplifies what happens when humans are placed in stressful, quick thinking situations. So allow me to open that up.
Name a yellow fruit.
Orange.
Name something that comes in pairs. Fred.
Bananas. Oh, God.
We asked 100 people to name a famous author. Kenny.
Shakespeare.
Arthur Shakespeare.
So if you want a good laugh, I recommend heading to check out some more of those bizarre Family Feud answers. But the question I want to ask is, do these contestants really think that oranges are yellow, that bananas come in pairs, that Shakespeare's first name is Arthur? I don't think so. Rather, when they are crunched for time, their mind starts to make all of these leaps and jumps and assumptions. They hear color and fruit and yell out orange. They mishear or misunderstand. They mistake the word, the name Arthur for the word author. They make strange leap from a bunch of bananas to a pair of bananas. To repeat, humans, simply put, are not very good at thinking quickly, and we are even worse at thinking ethically quickly. But this really isn't entirely negative, because if it is true that things like stress and rushing affect our capacity to work ethically, then just as there are practical steps that we can take in order to create a healthier work-life balance, there are similarly practical steps that we can take in order to foster our best ethical selves. When we stop thinking about ethics as who we are deep down in our heart of hearts, but instead about what we do objectively in the world, then we can think about strategies of practical wisdom that will allow us to build ethical habits in our work and life. When we talk about ethics and virtue, we tend to focus on things like courage, honesty, and justice. And these are undoubtedly central ethical virtues, but we seldom talk about time. And I think this is a mistake. As I've been insisting this whole afternoon, the way we spend our time is an ethical decision. For the Greek philosopher Aristotle, the proper maintenance of time was a component of what he names phronesis, a word that's often translated as prudence or practical wisdom. One of Aristotle's recent interpreters describes prudence as the capacity to discern how to do the right thing, in the right place, at the right time, in the right way. It is this at the right time that I want to think about this afternoon. While all virtues like courage and temperance and honesty are important, for Aristotle, practical wisdom is the virtue of virtues. It is, as the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas suggests, a virtue most necessary for human life. And this is because it is the key for translating our highest aspirations and values into our everyday actions, translating our knowledge and ideas about the best way we want to live into what we actually do. To do this, we must establish good habits. So it's easy to dismiss habit as morally or ethically neutral. Habits are things like biting our fingernails or drinking too much coffee. They may be better or worse, but they aren't really ethical concerns in a genuine sense. But here the thinkers of practical wisdom disagree. As Aristotle emphasized, it's no coincidence that the Greek word for virtue, ethos, is rooted in the Greek word for habit, ethos. As he writes, virtue or character results from habit. Hence its name ethical is only slightly varied from ethos. Virtues, he wants to say, are not naturally occurring. We are not born virtuous or vicious, good or evil. Rather, we train ourselves to be virtuous through the accumulation of good habits. In the same way that we accumulate musical skills through repetition and practice, and thereby become virtuosos, we can become virtuosos, that's to say, exemplars of ethical or moral action, only through consistent practice. So how do we build up good habits of time management such that we can not only work efficiently, but ethically? Here the key is about creating temporal space, or, in a word, taking our time. Now, to be clear, this isn't a suggestion to work slowly, or to simply work slowly. The idea that we must take our time to do our work with the appropriate ethical care isn't about delaying completion as long as possible. Rather, it's about finding, to use that phrase from earlier, the right time in which to complete our work. For Aristotle, virtues are not polar opposites of vices, but rather the midpoint or mean between vices. So what does he mean? So courage is not only cowardice, or it's not only the case that courage is not cowardice, but neither is true courage an unthinking recklessness. Generosity is not miserliness, but neither is it squandering one's money like a wasteful spendthrift. Practical wisdom is about discerning this golden mean between extremes. And this applies equally to the way that we take our time. While careless rushing through your work might put you in an ethically precarious situation, procrastination represents an equally problematic strain on ethics in the opposite direction. So on the one hand, when we think about procrastination, we can think about the employee's direct responsibility to their employer. As the ethicist Michael Austin notes, there are ethical issues here, as the employees have obligations to their employers, and if some time wasting ends up undermining rather than enhancing one's quality of work, then this is a problem. So scrolling Twitter at work would be an example of what he's describing. But even more substantial than this question of wasted time, or time theft as it's sometimes called, I want to suggest, is procrastination's tendency to put us into ethically precarious positions. While rushing through your work might appear to be exactly the opposite of procrastinating on it, the reality is that procrastination in the present necessitates hurried or rushed work, and therefore quite possibly unethical work, in the future. Because time is finite, wasted time in the present necessarily compresses available time in the future. As Chrysula Andreou and Mark White put it in The Thief of Time, Philosophical Essays on Procrastination, the one who chooses to procrastinate, quote, pays a steep price in the form of reduced well-being and shoddy work. And I see in the chat, and I apologize if I respond to the chat slowly, there's a little bit of a time delay, but there's a great comment by Kristen, who says that they read a book on classical Christian virtues and that it was very helpful for them. That's wonderful. So it is this compression of time that comes after procrastination that leaves us vulnerable to unethical temptations. It's when we feel rushed or hurried, when we feel out of control, that we make split-second decisions. And these times we can face ethical paralysis. Whether you're seeking corners to cut in order to finish a project on time, whether you are unable to take the time to determine what is the proper next step, whether you are simply unable to take the time to think through the consequences of your actions, it is extremely hard to work ethically when you are overwhelmed by the sense that you do not have enough time. And so, as above, I'd like to offer a few practical suggestions culled from ethical thinkers for creating good time management habits. First, and here are ethical suggestions in this section, sort of run parallel to the suggestion in the previous section. We need to take the time to organize our time. I'll say that again. We need to take the time to organize our time. Particularly when you encounter large and complicated projects, it is integral that you create a realistic plan for your project in advance. This means more than projecting a date of completion. It means breaking the project into manageable slices arranged in a realistic manner. And when I say realistic, I don't mean ideal, right? Rather, part of creating the proper space for ethical work is creating the necessary gaps within your time, gaps for inevitable overruns, for the breaks that allow you to work at your full capacity, for the proper review of your completed materials. To again quote the ethicist Bill O'Rourke, as you plan your tasks, be sure to include time to review, assess, and improve what you produce. If you don't build this into your timing, you'll develop a habit of finishing work just as it's needed. Without time to review what you've produced, you expose yourself to more errors. So that's number one. Number two, when necessary, seek more time, which is a scary, scary thought to do. When we talk about split-second decisions, we are often talking not about decisions that must be made in the moment, but about decisions that feel like they must be made in the moment. And learning to make that distinction is really important. Taking your time in this instance might mean something as little as saying, that's a great question. Give me 10 minutes to think about it. Even that small moment can allow you to think about ethical ramifications that could otherwise be ignored. So it's easy to imagine our deadlines as unquestionably firm when we are unwilling to seek more time. To again cite O'Rourke, always seek more time and be sure that the matter is truly urgent before allowing a perceived time crunch to affect your decision. Research repeatedly shows that quick decisions are usually less ethical. My point here is not to suggest that you miss due dates. I want to be as absolutely clear on that as possible. Fulfilling our obligations, including things like due dates, are themselves ethical values. Rather, what I want to suggest is that it is essential to determine when those time crunches are real and when they are merely felt. And if they are real, and you find yourself facing a crunch that could be ethically problematic, determine whether or not an extension is possible. Because when we refrain from allowing ourselves to ask these questions, we put ourselves in a position where ethical action becomes demonstrably more difficult. All right, that's number two, seek more time. and learn to split those. Third, and finally, working ethically is not something we do in isolation. Ethical work requires the creation of a social culture of ethical timekeeping. We are social animals, or more than that, we are pack animals. What we take to be ethical behavior is undoubtedly guided by our personal values and experiences, but it is also shaped by the company we keep and the values that are upheld by our colleagues and managers. Despite its trendy overuse, the idea of an organizational or corporate culture is real. As the ethicists Joseph Heath and Joel Anderson remark, some of the most important resources for overcoming procrastination are not portable individual assets, but are shared goods. This is why whistleblowers remain the exception rather than the rule. I recently had the privilege of interviewing Tyler Schultz, the whistleblower who took down Theranos, the $9 billion biotech juggernaut helmed by Elizabeth Holmes. His story is an inspiring tale of ethical courage, but also a cautionary tale. Because Tyler was not the first or only person to recognize serious ethical problems within the company. But the company created a hostile environment of fear, anxiety, and mistrust in which employees either remained silent or left in protest. There was no culture of healthy responsibility. And so when we talk about timekeeping as an ethical value, this responsibility likewise doesn't merely rest on the employee as a lone individual, but on the business as a whole. Are the corporate habits of time encouraging ethical behavior, or are they encouraging unethical behavior? Is the company a fragrant Cinnabon whose pleasant atmosphere encourages ethical action? And I mean that metaphorically, not literally. Or an oppressive Theranos, pressuring its employees to ignore and participate in unethical behaviors? These are really important questions. As we move toward the end of this presentation, I'd like to draw forward a case study for you to consider the ways in which the question of values that we discussed in the first half of this presentation and the question of ethical timekeeping that we discussed in the second half overlap in complex ways. So let me introduce you to this case study. And to be clear, important little note, this is a fictional case and any name similarities, etc., are purely coincidental, etc., etc. I feel like the little blurb at the beginning of Law & Order. All right. So let me put this on the screen if you want to follow along. So Sandra Nguyen is an accountant at Dernley & Associates CPA. She has been working steadily to close out the fiscal year for a small local bakery chain and is prepared to complete the work on Friday and then submit it in advance of its Monday deadline. Late that Thursday evening, she receives a call from her manager, indicating that the client has discovered additional materials that need to be factored into the final report before it is submitted. Sandra knows that properly working through the material isn't possible in one day, but she also has a weekend trip planned to attend her daughter's high school swim championships. What is Sandra's best ethical option here? Should she rush through the work on Friday to meet the deadline? Should she miss her daughter's championship and work through the weekend? Should she fail to submit the report by its deadline and finish it the following week? Other questions we might want to think about is, how could she have helped to avoid this situation? What is the manager's responsibility here? What is the client's responsibility here? So I'm going to open up a poll, and this poll is going to allow you to address just the first half. We'll talk about the second half. The first half of this question, which is, what do you take? If you were Sandra Nguyen, what would you do in this situation? So I will open up that poll. And I'm getting some reports. We've got a lot of failed to submit the report by its deadline and finish it the following week. This is in the lead, at least at this point, though there is a time delay. So moving the deadline. We've got a couple who suggest rush through work on Friday to meet the deadline and go to the swim meet. Good. Excellent. And I wanted to use this example, right? Because this is precisely what I talked about in the first half of this presentation, right? conflicting values, right? Finishing work by the deadline, that's a real value. That is something worth taking pride in. But attending to your daughter's championship is also a real value. Family is a real value. So how do we deal with this? I got some great comments in the chat. Explain the need for additional time to the client based on their late info. Explain the situation to your manager and see if someone can assist you. Excellent. So let's hop to the second half. The second half of this. So what are some ways that Sandra could have helped address the situation? What are some ways the manager could have helped address the situation? What about the client? Ask for additional time, ask for assistance. Absolutely. Explain the need for additional time to your superior. Yes. Discuss the time limitation. Check in with the client. The client should take some responsibility, right? Yeah, the client had missed some important paperwork. So do they bear some responsibility here for the missed deadline? Set expectations in the engagement letter about deliverables. Great, setting expectations. Bring the manager on board to help get more time, or to get the client on board with extending the deadline. Excellent. Somebody said resign, huh? That's great. Oh, so somebody pointed out maybe she didn't properly plan out her own schedule. So this is really interesting, right? We talked about the need to create time to review your work. Was there not enough review time that she had planned out in advance? Yeah. One that I want to add in, I tried to intentionally word it. I don't know if you noticed. The manager called her late at night on a Thursday night. That's a weird work-life boundary issue that maybe would be worth thinking about. Excellent. Yeah, all great. Great comments here. Wonderful, wonderful. All right. And so as I come to the end of this presentation, I see we have 7 minutes left, so we are rapidly reaching the end of our time. Where does this leave us in the end? So at the beginning of the presentation, I indicated that I would not be offering you a simple or trite solution to the conundrums of our finite time and our desire to live ethically in the world. Instead, what I want to leave you with is a charge to be deliberate with how you take your time. Right? So I'm not going to tell you how to take your time. In the same way, I'm not going to tell you what the right answer to the Sandra conundrum was, because I don't know, because it depends on our values. But what I want to leave you with is this charge to be deliberate, to think through how you use your time, to ask yourself what values you wish to embody with your timekeeping, to encourage you to ask yourself whether you are creating habits that encourage ethical behavior or habits that encourage unethical behavior. To ask yourself how you can work together with your colleagues to create a culture of ethical timekeeping and the way that you organize your work-life balance and the way that you organize your work projects. Because if we want to act ethically, then we need to act deliberately. We need to create healthy boundaries, and we need to create space for care, or, in short, we need to take our time. So this will bring us to the end. So thank you very much for spending this hour with me. At this point, I'm going to open up some space here. If you have any comments or questions, stump me, tell me I'm wrong, feel free to just use the Q&A. I should also add as a technical note that if you missed one of the poll questions, if you had technical issues or something, we have a last additional poll question that's just sort of a filler that can help you make sure that if you need that question. So we'll put that up at the end after some question time. So yes, any questions or anything like that? Oh, thank you for those very kind words, Stephen. I really appreciate it. Excellent. Well, what I'm going to do, I don't see too many questions. Oh, there we go. Company culture is so very important. Talking about the importance of maintaining boundaries. Wonderful. Excellent. So what I'm going to do is just put up on the screen now. This is my contact information. If you have anything else that you need from me, let me know. That is my email right there. And again, my name is Dr. Justin Leavitt Pearl from Carlow University's Atkins Center for Ethics. All right. Hey, somebody who worked with Bill O'Rourke. He's a wonderful guy. Actually, great question. Where am I getting the Bill O'Rourke quotes? He was a co-author of a book called the Business Ethics Field Guide. And in the additional information for this session, you'll actually find a link to his book. So if you want to pick that up, it's wonderful. If you get the audiobook, he actually recorded it. It's wonderful. All right, great question. It takes a full management team and a full staff team to truly execute this. I think yes and no, as far as needing a team. What I'm hoping that I left you here with is a sense that there are things that you can do as an individual to create healthy boundaries for yourself and for your job, as well as creating healthy boundaries, as well as tasks that are going to require you to work together with your colleagues. So I don't think that doing all of, creating the ideal time situation undoubtedly would take a full management team and full staff team. I think you're absolutely right. But I think that even in small ways, there are a lot of things that we can do in order to create more manageable expectations for ourselves and to create boundaries within our projects that allow us to work more deliberately, more slowly, and hopefully more ethically, ultimately. That's